The hidden collapse of Carolyn Jones. Hollywood glamour in a private battle. She was the queen of the macabre long before goth was a word. A woman who turned widow's peaks and black satin into armor. When Carolyn Jones stepped onto the set of the Addams Family in 1964, she didn't just play Morticia, she became her. The languid movements, the purring contralto, the arched eyebrow that promised both eternal damnation and a perfectly brewed cup of hemlock tea. She was Hollywood's idea of the ultimate dark fantasy, untouchable, ethereal, and sculpted from shadows. But the cameras, even the ones that loved her, never caught the tremor in her manicured hands. They never saw the way she pressed her spine against the wall of her dressing room to stretch out a pain that had no name. The public saw the glamour. The studios saw the asset. Her closest friends saw a woman silently drowning. This is not a story about Morticia Addams. This is the hidden collapse of Carolyn Jones, a girl born in the dusty panhandle of Texas who climbed the Hollywood ladder rung by bloody rung, only to discover that the view from the top was a lonely promontory overlooking a battlefield she was losing. It is a story of ambition, pesticides, a stomach that slowly ate itself, and the immense, exhausting labor of smiling while your bones turn to glass. The dust and the dream. Carolyn Sue Jones was born on April 28, 1930, in Amarillo, Texas. But Texas never owned her. Her childhood was a geography of lack of money, lack of stability, lack of a father who stayed. By the time she was 10, the family had fragmented, and she found herself in a cramped apartment in Hollywood with her mother, Chloe, and a grandmother who seemed to have been born bitter. This was the accidental advantage. While other girls dreamed of Kansas, Carolyn watched the real thing from her window. The neon signs and the studio gates, the distant searchlights that swept the sky like the breath of sleeping giants. Hollywood was not a fantasy to her. It was the nearest zip code. She could walk to Paramount if her shoes hadn't had holes in them. She was not a natural beauty in the conventional sense. Her face was too sharp, her eyes too wide set, her jaw too decisive. She looked like a Modigliani painting that had learned to smoke. That peculiarity, that off-kilter handsomeness, would become her currency. But at 14, it felt like a curse. She was gawky, intense, and desperately poor. To escape the squalor of her apartment, she started spending her afternoons at the Pasadena Playhouse. She swept floors. She sewed costumes. She watched the actors from the wings, memorizing the way they inhaled before a monologue, the way they held silence like a physical object. She learned early that acting was not about pretending. It was about knowing. To play a woman in pain, you had to have touched the floor of your own despair. She dropped out of high school at 17. There was no dramatic rebellion, just the cold arithmetic of necessity. The family needed money, and Carolyn had discovered that she could generate more of it with her face than with a waitress's apron. She started modeling, catalogs, low-rent ads. Nothing glamorous, but the camera, for the first time in her life, looked at her without flinching. The grind. The 1950s were a machine, and Carolyn Jones was determined to be a cog. She got her first film role in 1952, an uncredited bit in The Turning Point. Her lines, if they could be called that, totaled 3 words. She delivered them like Shakespeare. The director, a man whose name she would later pretend to forget, patted her on the shoulder and said, "Cute, lose the intensity." She didn't lose it. She couldn't. Intensity was all she had. For the next 3 years, she became a ghost in the studio system, a face in the background of the War of the Worlds, a screaming blonde in The Big Heat, a girl in a towel who gets strangled in The Silver Chalice. She died on screen more times than she could count, and each death was a small release. The pay was starvation wages. The casting couches were real. The men in power had hands that wandered and contracts that locked. She survived, as women did then, by being simultaneously available and unreachable. She learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to tilt her head just so, to say thank you when a producer told her that she'd look better 10 pounds lighter. And then, in 1954, a door cracked open. Stanley Kubrick was making The Killing, a lean, mean heist film. He needed a woman to play the treacherous wife, a creature of cigarettes, liquor, and casual cruelty. He saw Carolyn's screen test and stopped. "That one," he said. "She looks like she's already betrayed someone." The role was small, 30 seconds of screen time. But Kubrick photographed her like she was a Caravaggio. The shadows pooled under her cheekbones. Her eyes in close-up held a terrifying emptiness. Critics noticed. They didn't remember her name, but they wrote about the blonde femme fatale with the death's head smile. She clipped those reviews and pasted them into a notebook. Underneath, she wrote, "Work, don't stop. The rise." The late 1950s were her ascension. She won a Golden Globe for The Bachelor Party, a film that asked the radical question of what men did when women weren't watching. She was nominated for an Academy Award for The Bachelor Party? No, correct that. She was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for The Bachelor Party in 1957. The award went to Jo Van Fleet. Carolyn smiled in the audience. Her smile lasted exactly 3 seconds longer than it should have. But the nomination changed the calculus. She was no longer just a face. She was a nominee. Paramount signed her to a 7-year contract. She bought a house. She bought a car that wasn't held together with prayers. And she bought a marriage certificate, the first of 4. Her first husband was Aaron Spelling. Yes, that Aaron Spelling. Before the dynasties, before Charlie's Angels and Beverly Hills, 90210, he was just a struggling producer with acne scars and a ferocious work ethic. They met in 1953. He was nervous, she was bored. They fell into something that felt like love, but was probably just two ambitious people recognizing each other's hunger. The marriage lasted 11 years. 11 years of Carolyn's star rising and Aaron's star rising slower. He wanted a wife who would stay home and host dinners. She wanted a career that would not apologize for itself. They fought about everything: money, time, the fact that she was more famous. But the real fracture was quieter. Carolyn started getting sick. It began in 1959. After a long day on the set of The Man in the Net, she felt a knot in her stomach. Not a cramp, something deeper, something that felt like a fist squeezing. She ignored it. Actresses ignored things. You popped a bicarbonate, drank a ginger ale, and got back to the mark. But the fist didn't unclench. It came back a week later, then a day later, then every afternoon, like a clockwork punishment. She went to a doctor, the first of many. He listened to her stomach. He asked about her diet. She smoked 2 packs a day and lived on black coffee and adrenaline. He shrugged. "Nervous stomach," he said. "Take this, rest more." She took the pills. She did not rest. The set of King of the Wild Stallions was not a place for rest. Morticia in the Mask. The Addams Family. It was the role that would define her, trap her, and, in strange ways, save her. The concept was absurd. A sitcom about a family of ghouls based on Charles Addams's New Yorker cartoons. Network executives hated it. Test audiences didn't know what to make of it. But Carolyn read the script and felt a shock of recognition. Morticia was not a monster. Morticia was a hostess. She was a woman in complete control of her domain, cool, collected, and utterly unflappable. Nothing frightened her. Not the hand crawling across the floor. Not the cousin who lived in the attic. Not the abyss. That was the mask Carolyn needed. She fought for the role. The producers wanted someone more overtly sexy, a Jane Mansfield type in a black wig. Carolyn walked into the audition wearing her own hair pulled back severe, a long black dress she'd sewn herself, and an expression of absolute regal boredom. She read the lines flat, not monotone but measured, as if she had said everything 1,000 times before and was only repeating herself out of politeness. She got the part in the room. The costume was a torture device. The famous tent dress was a single piece of heavy satin that weighed 10 pounds. The wig, her real hair lacquered with black dye, gave her headaches that radiated down her neck. And the makeup, the pale foundation, the exaggerated lashes, the lipstick the color of dried blood, took 2 hours to apply and 1 hour to remove. But when she put it on, she transformed. Morticia did not have problems. Morticia did not have a stomach that burned. Morticia did not have a husband who resented her success, Aaron, and she would divorce that same year. Morticia was not afraid of dying. The show ran for 2 seasons, 64 episodes, each one a masterclass in controlled performance. Watch her now. Notice the way she never blinks during a close-up. Notice how her hands are always still, resting on some prop, a candelabra, a book of spells, her son's head. Those hands, they never shake on camera. But between takes, she would retreat to her trailer and press them between her thighs to stop the tremors. The pain had graduated from a fist to a knife. By the second season, she was vomiting after meals. Not purging. She never had an eating disorder in the Hollywood sense, but rejecting. Her body was refusing to digest food. She lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. The satin dress had to be taken in 3 times. The costume designer, a kind woman named Lillian, asked if she was okay. Carolyn smiled, that slow Addams smile, and said, "Darling, I've never been better." She was lying, and she was getting very, very good at it. The silence of the sick. This is the part of the story that Hollywood does not tell. The part where the star goes home and locks the door and leans over the toilet until her throat is raw. The part where the phone rings, a producer, an agent, a friend, and she answers in Morticia's voice, because that voice is the only one that doesn't sound like it's begging. Between 1966 and 1977, Carolyn Jones worked constantly. She did guest spots on Batman, Love, American Style, The Mod Squad. She voiced characters on the new Addams Family cartoon. She took roles in B-movies with titles like The Iger Sanction and The Killing of Sister George. She toured in dinner theater, the last stop for fading stars, playing faded Southern belles in faded Tennessee Williams plays. On stage, she could control the narrative. Off stage, she could not. The medical file, if it was ever consolidated, would read like a horror novel. By 1969, she had seen 17 specialists. Their diagnoses varied wildly. Ulcers, gastritis, pancreatitis, a psychosomatic conversion disorder, the polite way of saying it's in your head, and finally, in 1973, something that sounded final. Precancerous lesions of the stomach lining. The doctor who delivered that news was a thin man with a bow tie. He sat her down in a sterile room and used words like gastrectomy and prognosis and quality of life. She heard the words but translated them into a language she understood. "You are broken. You may not get fixed." She asked how long she had if she did nothing. The doctor hesitated. "Years," he said, "but painful ones." She asked how long she had if she did the surgery. A partial removal of her stomach. "Longer," he said, "but you'll never eat normally again. You'll need a special diet, digestive enzymes, constant monitoring." Carolyn Jones, who had spent her life consuming stress and producing art, looked at the doctor and laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been told that the organ that had been torturing her for 14 years was, in fact, trying to kill her. She had the surgery. She did not tell the press. She did not tell most of her friends. She told her mother, who cried, and her third husband, a musician named Peter Bailey Britton, who would later say that watching her recover was like watching a bird knit its own broken wing. Recovery was a nightmare. She couldn't keep down solid food for 6 weeks. She lived on broth and jello and a kind of protein slurry that tasted like chalk. Her weight dropped to 90 pounds. Her famous cheekbones looked like blades. She looked ironically exactly like Morticia would look if Morticia had been dying. But she went back to work. Of course she did. She filmed the new Addams Family voice sessions from a portable bed they set up in the recording studio. The sound engineers learned to listen for the moment she would gasp, a small, sharp inhalation of pain, and stop the tape. She would wave them on. "Keep rolling," she'd whisper. "I'll loop it later." The private battle takes public form. By 1977, the hidden collapse was no longer entirely hidden. The weight loss was too dramatic. The pallor underneath the makeup was too green. Columnists started whispering, "Is Carolyn Jones ill? Is she on drugs? Is she dying?" The last question was the closest to the truth. The cancer, the doctors now believed, had not been fully excised. The lesions had returned, this time in her colon. She needed another surgery, then another, then chemotherapy, the old kind, the kind that made you lose your hair and your appetite and your will to get out of bed. She bought wigs, not costume wigs, regular ones in shades of brown and blonde. She hated them. They itched. They reminded her of Morticia. But Morticia was a character, and this was real life. And real life required her to go to the grocery store without causing a scene. Her fourth husband, a man named Herbert Bud Anderson, a retired airline pilot, was the one who saw the worst of it. He had married Carolyn Jones, the glamorous star. He found himself living with a woman who spent 3 hours a day in the bathroom, who kept a heating pad permanently plugged in beside the bed, who woke up screaming some nights from dreams she would not describe. He stayed. For 5 years, he stayed. He learned to administer her injections. He drove her to Sloan Kettering for treatments that left her weeping in the car. He held her when she vomited. He loved her, I think, in the quiet way that ordinary men love extraordinary women, with confusion, with devotion, with the helpless acknowledgement that he could not fix what was breaking her. She tried to keep working. In 1979, she appeared in The Love Boat, a mercy gig, a favor from an old producer. She played a faded movie star, naturally. The irony was not lost on her. On the day of her big scene, she had to do 11 takes because she couldn't stop coughing. The cough was from the fluid building up in her lungs, a side effect of the cancer's slow march. She asked the director for a glass of water between takes. She drank it. She coughed again. She smiled. "One more," she said. The director, a man who had worked with her on the Addams Family 15 years earlier, pulled her aside. "Carolyn," he said, "you don't have to do this." She looked at him. For a moment the mask slipped. He saw the woman underneath. The pain, the exhaustion, the terror. Then the mask snapped back. "Yes, I do," she said. "It's the only thing I know how to do." The last curtain call. By 1981, Carolyn was living on borrowed time and borrowed dignity. The cancer had metastasized to her liver. The doctors gave her 6 months. She gave them 2 years because Carolyn Jones had always been bad at following orders. She moved back to the small house in West Hollywood she had bought decades earlier. It was a modest place, nothing like the mansions of her peers. She had never been good with money. Studio contracts in the 1950s were designed to keep stars poor. She had a small pension from the Screen Actors Guild, a few residual checks from the Addams Family reruns, and Bud's retirement income. People from her past started appearing. Aaron Spelling, her first husband, sent a card and a check. She cashed the check and kept the card on her nightstand. John Astin, who had played Gomez, visited once. They sat in her backyard, a scrappy patch of dirt with one stubborn rosebush, and did not talk about the old show. They talked about nothing, the weather, the traffic, the way the light fell across the patio. It was the most honest conversation they ever had. She did not go gentle. She raged, but privately. Her journals, sealed for years after her death, reveal a woman of astonishing fury. She wrote about the doctors who had dismissed her early symptoms. "Nervous stomach? I'll show you a nervous stomach when I haunt you from the grave." She wrote about the studio heads who had demanded she lose weight while her body was eating itself. She wrote about the loneliness of being sick in an industry that worships wellness. But she also wrote about gratitude, about the fans who sent letters, about the children who wrote to Morticia asking for advice about being weird. She answered every single letter. By the end, her handwriting was shaky, unrecognizable from the elegant script she had once used. But she answered. Her last public appearance was in 1982 at a charity event for children's cancer research. The irony was unbearable. She wore a black dress, she always wore black, and a wig that didn't quite sit right. She looked, the photographer later said, like a ghost who had forgotten to be invisible. She gave a short speech. Her voice, once a purr, was a rasp. She talked about courage, about the children she had met who were fighting their own battles. She did not mention her own battle. That was not the point. The point was the mask, the performance, the refusal to let the audience see the collapse behind the curtain. When she finished, the applause was deafening. She stood in it for a long moment. Then she walked off stage, found a chair in the wings, and sat down heavily. A volunteer asked if she needed water. "No, dear," she whispered. "I need a new body." The quiet exit. Carolyn Jones died on August 3, 1983. She was 53 years old. The official cause was colorectal cancer, but the true cause was exhaustion. The bone-deep, soul-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent 30 years smiling through a nightmare. She died at home in her own bed, with Bud holding her hand. Her mother was in the next room, too frail to stand. The last thing Carolyn said, according to Bud, was not profound. It was not a line from a movie. It was just, "Turn the light off. I'm tired." The press covered her death respectfully. Obituaries mentioned the Addams family, the Oscar nomination, the four husbands. They used words like unique and talented and eccentric. They ran a photo of her as Morticia because that was how the world knew her. But they did not tell the real story. The real story was not in the obituaries. It was in the medical records sealed in a filing cabinet. It was in the journals her family kept private for 20 years. It was in the memory of every assistant, every nurse, every friend who had watched her vomit blood into a basin and then powder her nose and walk back onto a soundstage like nothing had happened. The real story is this. Carolyn Jones was one of the bravest actresses who ever lived, and her bravest role was not Morticia Addams. It was Carolyn Jones, the woman who got dressed every morning while her organs failed, who showed up to work while her stomach digested itself, who laughed at jokes that hurt her throat, who smiled for the cameras until the very end. She did not collapse publicly. That's the point. She collapsed privately, over and over, like a building imploding from the inside. And each time she rebuilt herself enough to stand for one more take. What she left behind. After her death, the tributes poured in, but the most interesting tribute was silent. For years, the Addams family remained a cult curiosity, a black and white artifact of a stranger time. But something shifted in the 1990s when the movies came out, and then again in the 2010s when the Netflix series introduced Morticia to a new generation. Young women started dressing like her. Not just for Halloween, every day. Black dresses, heavy eyeliner, that languid, unbothered posture. They called it Morticia energy. They meant it as an aspiration. A woman who cannot be rattled, who is above the petty dramas of the world, who glides through chaos with a martini and a quiet smirk. They didn't know the real Morticia energy was forged in a bathroom in West Hollywood, in the small hours of the morning, with a heating pad pressed to a belly full of scars. They didn't know that the woman who inspired that energy spent her final years terrified and in pain, clinging to a career that was slowly killing her. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point of performance is not to transmit the truth of the performer's suffering, but to transform that suffering into something beautiful. Carolyn Jones understood that better than anyone. She took her broken body and her broken heart and her broken dreams, and she turned them into a woman in a black dress who was afraid of nothing. That is not a lie. That is alchemy. We tell stories about Hollywood stars because we want to believe in transcendence, that grace can be bought with fame, that suffering can be traded for beauty. Carolyn Jones's life is a corrective to that fantasy. She was glamorous and she was dying. She was beloved and she was alone. She was an icon and she was a woman who threw up in her dressing room trash can and then went back to the mark and said her lines perfectly, every time. The hidden collapse is not a tragedy. It is a testament. It is the proof that glamour is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to struggle in couture. Carolyn Jones made that decision every day for 30 years. And then, on a quiet August morning, she stopped making it. Turned the light off. She was tired. But the image remains. The arched brow, the black satin, the smile that knows something you don't. That is Carolyn Jones's final, greatest performance. And the secret of that performance, the hidden collapse that made it real, is the thing she never told anyone until now. The body remembers everything. The problem with a hidden collapse is that the body keeps score. Carolyn Jones understood this long before the doctors gave it a name. She had spent her entire adult life telling herself that mind over matter was not just a slogan, but a survival strategy. If she could think herself through the pain, if she could act her way past the nausea, then the pain and the nausea were not real. They were just inconvenient stage directions. But by 1979, the body staged a revolt that no amount of acting could quell. It began with her hands, the same hands that had caressed things, that had stirred imaginary poison, that had signed autographs in elegant loops. They started to shake uncontrollably, not from nerves, from something deeper, a neurological tremor that the doctors initially dismissed as essential tremor, a benign condition common in older women. But Carolyn was 49, and she was not benign. She hid the shaking by keeping her hands in constant motion. On set, she would clasp them together, intertwine her fingers, rest them on a table. In interviews, she would gesture broadly, turning the tremor into a kind of dramatic punctuation. No one noticed, or if they did, they attributed it to her eccentricity. But at night, alone in the bathroom of her West Hollywood bungalow, she would hold her hands under cold water and watch them dance. She would talk to them. "Stop it," she would whisper. "Stop it now." They did not stop. They had their own agenda. The real diagnosis came from a neurologist at UCLA in March of 1980. After a battery of tests, blood work, a spinal tap, an interminable hour inside an MRI machine that felt like a coffin, the doctor sat her down and used a word she had been dreading. Neuropathy. Peripheral neuropathy, to be precise. Damage to the nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. The cause? Likely a combination of years of malnutrition. Her compromised stomach could not absorb B vitamins, the chemotherapy she had undergone for the colon cancer, and the original gastric surgery that had rewired her digestive system in ways that no one fully understood. "Is it reversible?" she asked. The doctor, a young man with kind eyes and no ability to lie, shook his head. "We can manage the symptoms, but the nerve damage is permanent." Carolyn sat in the plastic chair. She was wearing a black wool coat and a silk scarf. She looked, as she always looked, like a woman posing for a photograph. Inside, she was screaming. She asked the only question that mattered to her. "Can I still work?" The doctor hesitated. "You can try, but you'll need a cane for balance, and you'll need to rest frequently. The fatigue is going to be significant." She thanked him. She walked out of his office, down the corridor, past the staring patients in the waiting room. She did not use a cane. She would not use a cane for another 18 months, and by then the cane would be not a choice, but a necessity. The last 3 years of Carolyn Jones's working life are a catalog of small humiliations and quiet victories. She took whatever came her way. A voiceover for a cartoon, a guest spot on a forgotten sitcom called The Love Boat, her second appearance. The one where she played a hypochondriac, the irony so thick you could cut it. A walk-on in a television movie called Capital Punishment, where she played a judge's wife, a role that required her to sit in a chair for the entire scene. She sat beautifully. No one knew that the chair was not a blocking choice, but a medical necessity. The production crews on these low-budget projects were young. They had grown up watching the Addams Family in syndication, but they did not know the woman behind the widow's peak. To them, she was just another aging actress. Thin, pale, a little shaky, but game. She never complained. She never asked for special treatment. When the director said, "Action," she rose from her chair, walked to her mark, delivered her lines, and walked back. The walking was the hardest part. Each step felt like wading through wet cement. Between takes, she would retreat to a corner and press her forehead against the cool wall. The young production assistants learned to bring her tea, not coffee anymore. The acid was too much, and to not ask questions. She tipped them well from the small envelope of cash she kept in her purse. "For your trouble, dear," she would say. "I know I'm not easy." She was easier than most, actually. She never yelled, never threw a diva fit, never demanded a better trailer or a later call time. The only thing she demanded was that no one talk about her health. "I'm fine," she would say, with a smile that dared you to contradict her. "A little tired. The heat, you know." The heat in Los Angeles, in a soundstage, in October. No one contradicted her. The husbands and the ghosts. To understand the hidden collapse, one must understand the men who orbited Carolyn Jones. They were not villains. They were not heroes. They were, like most husbands, complicated figures who loved her imperfectly and failed her in the ways that husbands fail. Aaron Spelling, her first, was already a giant by the time their marriage ended in 1964. He had produced the Zane Grey Theater in Berks Law. He would go on to become the most powerful producer in television history. But during his marriage to Carolyn, he was still climbing, and she was already there. The power imbalance, she more famous, he more ambitious, festered. He wanted a wife who would attend his business dinners. She wanted a husband who would hold her hair back when she vomited. He did not hold her hair back. He was not that kind of man. He was a builder, a tactician, a man who kept a wall of telephones on his desk and answered every single one himself. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. And absence in the face of illness is its own cruelty. After the divorce, Carolyn rarely spoke of him publicly. But in her journal, she wrote, "Aaron loved me the way a man loves a painting. He wanted to own me, to frame me, to hang me in a place of honor. But he never wanted to touch the canvas and feel the paint still wet." Her second husband, a retired businessman named Robert L.B. She would later say his full name was too boring to remember, lasted 2 years. He was kind, dull, and terrified of her sharp edges. He left when the gastric problems became impossible to ignore. "I can't watch you suffer," he said, which Carolyn translated as, "I can't watch you suffer in front of me." She did not fight the divorce. She signed the papers without reading them. Third came Peter Bailey Britton, a British musician and composer. He was handsome in a rumpled way, with a beard and a gentle voice. They married in 1968, and for a brief window, perhaps 2 years, Carolyn was almost happy. He wrote music for her. He sat with her during the long nights when the pain made sleep impossible. He learned to make the pureed soup she could stomach, carrot ginger, butternut squash, a thin chicken broth that she called liquid courage. But Peter drank. Not a little, a lot. He was a functioning alcoholic, charming and unreliable. Carolyn, who had spent her life around drunks, her father had been one, recognized the pattern immediately. She tried to save him. She failed. He tried to save her. He also failed. They divorced in 1973, the same year she had her first gastric surgery. "I loved him," she wrote, "but love is not a lifeboat, it's just a wooden board." And we were both drowning. Herbert Bud Anderson, the retired airline pilot, the ordinary man, he met Carolyn in 1976 at a charity golf tournament. She was not playing golf. She could barely walk 9 holes. But she was there to support a friend. Bud was there because his boss had given him free tickets, and he had nothing better to do. He saw her sitting alone on a bench, away from the crowd, her face tilted toward the sun. She was not wearing makeup. Her hair was gray at the temples. She looked, he would later say, like a woman who had forgotten to be famous. He walked over and sat down next to her. He did not say, "I loved you in the Addams Family," or "You were robbed of that Oscar." He said, "You look like you could use a sandwich." She laughed, a real laugh, not the practiced one. "I can't eat sandwiches, dear, but I could use some company." They talked for 2 hours, about nothing, about everything, about flying. He told her about the time his engine failed over the Pacific, and he had to glide the plane to a landing strip in Baja. About acting, she told him about the time she had to kiss a man with bad breath in The Man in the Net, and the director made her do 17 takes. They did not talk about illness. They did not talk about the past. They talked about the present, and the present was a bench in the sun, and that was enough. They married in 1977. She wore a simple white dress, he wore a blue suit. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. The reception was in her backyard. She served ginger ale and crackers. No one complained. The slow burn of 1982. The year 1982 was the beginning of the end. Carolyn knew it. Bud knew it. Even her mother, Chloe, who had slipped into dementia and often forgot her own name, seemed to sense it. The cancer was back. Not in the colon this time. The doctors had removed that section 2 years earlier. But in the liver. Metastasis, the word that means the party is over. She opted for a new experimental treatment. Immunochemotherapy, a cocktail of drugs designed to trick her own immune system into attacking the tumors. The treatment was brutal. It required 4-hour infusions twice a week, followed by days of flu-like symptoms that left her curled in a fetal position. Her hair fell out again. Her skin turned gray. Her eyes, those magnificent wide-set eyes that had launched 1,000 crushes, took on a yellow tinge from the failing liver. Bud kept a notebook. He wrote down her symptoms, her medications, her bowel movements, the doctors insisted. He wrote down her moods, too. March 14th, good day, ate half a bowl of soup, watched an old movie, laughed at a commercial. March 17th, bad day, vomited all morning, cried for an hour, said she wanted to die, then took it back. March 22nd, neutral day, slept most of the time, did not complain. The notebook, discovered after his death in 2005, is a devastating document. Page after page of quiet devotion of a man doing his best to hold back a tide with a teaspoon. On April 28, 1982, her 52nd birthday, Bud wrote simply, "She woke up and said, 'Another one.' I said, 'Happy birthday.' She said, 'Is it?' Then she went back to sleep." That same month, she received a letter from a fan, a 12-year-old girl in Ohio who had discovered the Addams Family on late-night television. The girl wrote, "Dear Morticia, I don't have any friends at school because I'm weird, but you're weird too, and everyone loves you. How do you do it?" Carolyn dictated a response to Bud. She was too weak to write. "Dear weird girl," she said, "you don't have to be loved by everyone. You just have to be loved by yourself. And if that's hard, pretend. Pretend until the pretending becomes real." That's what I did. It worked for me, mostly. Love, Morticia and Carolyn. Bud mailed the letter. He never told Carolyn that the girl's return address was incomplete, and the letter likely never arrived. Sometimes, he thought, the act of writing was enough. The last interview. In July of 1982, a journalist named Martha Weinman Lear came to the bungalow. She was writing a piece for the New York Times Magazine about aging actresses. Carolyn had agreed to the interview weeks earlier, before the latest round of treatments had laid her flat. Now she regretted it. But she was Carolyn Jones, and Carolyn Jones did not cancel. Lear later wrote a private account of the visit, unpublished until after Carolyn's death. "It is the most honest portrait we have. She met me at the door in a black kaftan and a turban. The turban, I realized later, was hiding her baldness. She wore earrings the size of baby fists. Her makeup was flawless, foundation, eyeliner, lipstick, but the skin underneath was the color of old paper. She shook my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. 'Forgive the mess,' she said. The living room was immaculate. 'I've been dead for 3 days. Just got back.' She laughed. I laughed. We both knew she wasn't entirely joking. We sat in her backyard. The rose bush was blooming, a single red rose. She pointed to it. 'That one,' she said, 'is tougher than I am. Survived a freeze, an aphid infestation, and a gardener who thought it was a weed.' She asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. She called out to Bud, who appeared with a tray. He moved with the careful precision of a man holding something fragile. For 2 hours she talked. Not about dying, never about dying, but about living. About the Pasadena Playhouse. About Kubrick's perfectionism. About the night she met Frank Sinatra at a party, and he told her she had a hell of a face. She spoke in complete sentences, each one a small performance. She never lost her train of thought. She never coughed. She never winced. But I noticed her hands. They were wrapped in a blanket. Not for warmth, it was July, but to hide the shaking. And I noticed that she did not eat or drink anything. The cup of tea sat untouched for the entire interview. When I stood to leave, she stood too. She walked me to the door. She did not use a cane. Later, Bud told me that she had practiced that walk 15 times that morning because she knew I would be watching her leave. At the door, she took my hand. "Write something kind," she said, "but don't make me a saint. Saints are boring. Write me as a woman who tried and sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed spectacularly." I asked her what she wanted people to remember. She thought for a moment, and she smiled, that slow Addams smile, and said that I showed up, even when I shouldn't have. The summer of 1983. The final months were a slow withdrawal from the world. Carolyn stopped answering the phone. She stopped reading scripts. She stopped putting on makeup except on Sundays, when Bud would help her into a dress and drive her to the little Episcopal church on Fountain Avenue, where she would sit in the back pew and listen to the hymns. She was not religious. She had told Bud once that she believed in the electricity between people, not the man upstairs. But she loved the music, the old hymns, the ones about valleys and shadows and being gathered in. In June, she received a letter from John Aston. He had heard she was ill. He wrote a long, rambling, affectionate letter full of memories from the Addams Family set. The time she accidentally set her wig on fire with a candle. The time she taught him to do the tango for a scene and he stepped on her feet 17 times. The time they stayed up all night playing Monopoly and she cheated so outrageously that he couldn't help but laugh. She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and placed it under her pillow. When Bud asked if she wanted to write back, she shook her head. "Tell him I said thank you," she whispered. "Tell him I loved every minute." She did not say, "I love him." She was careful with that word. She had used it too freely in her youth, and it had cost her. In July, the pain became unbearable. The liver was now enlarged, pressing against her diaphragm, making it difficult to breathe. The doctor prescribed morphine. Carolyn resisted for 3 days. She had seen what morphine did to her mother, the fog it put behind the eyes, but finally relented. The first dose was a revelation. For the first time in decades, the fist unclenched. She slept, a deep, dreamless, 8-hour sleep that Bud said was the most peaceful he had ever seen her. When she woke, she was confused. She did not know where she was. She asked for her mother. Her mother was in the next room, asleep. She asked for Aaron Spelling. Bud said, "He's not here, honey." She said, "Good. I never liked his haircut." She spent her last weeks in a hospital bed that Bud had rented and set up in the living room. The backyard was visible through the sliding glass door. The rose bush had bloomed again, a profusion of red, as if the plant knew it was her final curtain. She would stare at it for hours, not speaking. The end came on August 3rd, 1983. The morning was clear and hot. Bud had given her the morphine at 6 a.m. She had sipped a little water. She had asked him to open the door to the backyard. He did. The rose bush was in full sun. At 10:17 a.m., she opened her eyes. She looked at Bud. She looked at the rose bush. She looked at the ceiling. And then she closed her eyes again. The nurse, who had been dozing in a chair, checked her pulse. "She's gone," the nurse said. Bud did not believe her. He took Carolyn's hand. It was warm. He held it for a long time. He waited for her to squeeze back. She did not. The official time of death was recorded as 10:23 a.m., but Bud always believed she had died 6 minutes earlier, in the moment she closed her eyes. "She wanted to go alone," he later told a friend. "She didn't want me to watch. So she waited until I looked away." The funeral nobody saw. Carolyn Jones had planned her own funeral. She had written the instructions in her journal, in the same elegant hand she had used for her high school essays. No fanfare, no press, no photographs. "I want to be cremated. I want my ashes scattered in the rose garden at the Pasadena Playhouse. I want the service to be small. I want Bud to play a recording of Billie Holiday singing, 'I'll Be Seeing You.' I want everyone to cry for exactly 5 minutes, and then I want them to have champagne." The funeral was held on August 7, 1983, at the Church of the Recessional in Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the same place where so many Hollywood stars had taken their final bow. But this service was not for stars. It was for the family. Only 12 people attended. Bud, Chloe, her mother, who was so far gone in dementia that she asked twice where Carolyn was. Aaron Spelling sent a floral arrangement, but did not come. Peter Bailey Britton was in London and sent a telegram. John Aston came. He sat in the back row, alone, and wept openly. The minister, a young woman who had never met Carolyn, gave a brief eulogy. She spoke about courage and grace and the light that shines in darkness. It was generic. It could have been written for anyone. But then Bud stood up. He had not planned to speak, but he stood anyway. "Carolyn," he said, his voice breaking, "was the funniest person I ever knew. Not funny like a comedian. Funny like a woman who had seen the worst and decided to laugh anyway. She used to say that life was a B-movie. Bad lighting, terrible dialogue, but a great soundtrack. She made her own soundtrack. She made her own lighting. She made her own everything. And I'm going to miss her until the day I die." He sat down. The room was silent. Then John Aston stood and walked to the piano in the corner of the chapel. He had not been asked to play, but he sat down anyway. And he played a waltz. Not a hymn, a waltz. The same waltz that had played over the closing credits of the Addams Family. The sprightly, slightly sinister tune that had accompanied Morticia and Gomez's Eternal Dance. He played it imperfectly. He missed notes. He started over twice. But by the time he finished, everyone in the room was crying, including the minister. Billie Holiday's voice filled the chapel. "I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places." And then it was over. The champagne was served in the garden. People drank it, standing up, in the sun. No one spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. The ashes and the aftermath. Bud scattered Carolyn's ashes on a Tuesday morning in October. He had waited 2 months, not because he was stalling, but because he wanted the roses to be in bloom. The garden at the Pasadena Playhouse was small and meticulously maintained. He had permission from the board, granted after a brief, awkward conversation in which he had to explain that he was not a crazy person, just a widower. He stood alone among the rose bushes. He had brought a small silver urn. He opened it. The ashes were gray and fine, like sand. He had expected them to be heavier. He scattered them in a wide arc, letting the wind take most of them. Some landed on the petals of a white rose. Some drifted toward the stage door. Some disappeared into the sky. He stood there for a long time. Then he brushed the remaining ash from his hands, tucked the urn under his arm, and walked back to his car. He did not look back. He had promised her he wouldn't. For years afterward, fans left flowers at the garden. They had somehow found out. They left notes too. "Thank you for being weird. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for Morticia." The Playhouse eventually put up a small plaque. It reads simply, "Carolyn Jones, 1930 to 1983. She showed up." The hidden collapse revealed. Why does this story matter? Why excavate the pain of a woman who died 40 years ago, whose films are watched mostly by cultists and nostalgists, whose name is not spoken in the same breath as Hepburn or Davis or Stanwyck? It matters because the hidden collapse is not unique to Carolyn Jones. It is the secret history of almost every woman who has ever stood in the spotlight. The ones who smiled through miscarriages. The ones who wore girdles to hide the colostomy bags. The ones who took vitamins that were actually tranquilizers. The ones who drank themselves to sleep and woke up to makeup calls at 5 a.m. Hollywood is a machine that grinds women into powder and then sells the powder as glamour. Carolyn Jones understood this better than most. She was ground, she was powdered, but she refused to be sold as anything less than what she was. A fighter, a fraud, a genius, a mess. Her collapse was hidden not because she was ashamed, but because she was practical. She knew that the audience did not want to see scaffolding. They wanted to see the cathedral. So she built the cathedral every day, stone by painful stone, and she never let them see the cracks. But the cracks were there. They were always there. In the end, the hidden collapse becomes visible to those who know where to look. It is visible in the later photographs, the hollow cheeks, the haunted eyes, the way she leans slightly to the left because her right hip hurts. It is visible in the late performances, the slight hesitation before a line, the hand that reaches for a chair that is not there. It is visible in the silence of her final years, the interviews she declined, the parties she skipped, the phone calls she let go to voicemail. She was hiding, but she was also resting. And resting for a woman who had spent 30 years running was its own kind of victory. What Carolyn Jones taught us. She taught us that glamour is not a gift. It is a discipline. The arched eyebrow, the purring voice, the effortless grace. None of it was effortless. It was rehearsed, practiced, perfected in thousands of small moments when she could have let go and chose not to. She taught us that pain is not a weakness. It is simply a fact, and facts can be managed, accommodated, worked around. She never used her pain as an excuse. She never asked for special treatment. She never made her suffering the subject of her art. Her art was always about something else, about love, about death, about the comedy of being human. The pain was just the fuel. The art was the fire. She taught us that a woman can be both strong and fragile, that a woman can hold her own hand while falling apart, that a woman can die slowly over decades and still find reasons to laugh. And she taught us that the mask is not a lie. The mask is a choice to present to the world a version of yourself that is capable, composed, and just a little bit terrifying. The mask protects the soft thing underneath. The soft thing is real, but the mask is real too. Carolyn Jones wore her mask until the very end, and when she finally took it off in that hospital bed in West Hollywood, there was no one there to see. Just Bud, just the rose bush, just the fading light of an August afternoon. She showed up, even when she shouldn't have. That is her legacy. Not the Oscar nomination, not the Golden Globe, not the 64 episodes of a black and white sitcom about a family of ghouls, but the showing up, the getting out of bed, the putting on of the face even when the face was a lie, the walking to the mark, the saying of the lines, the final quiet exit. There is a postscript to this story, and it is small. In 1996, 13 years after Carolyn's death, Bud Anderson married again. A widow named Eleanor, kind and practical. They moved to a small house in Palm Springs. Bud took the rose bush with him, dug it up from the West Hollywood bungalow, and replanted it in the desert. Against all odds, it survived. It thrived. It bloomed every spring, red and defiant. Bud died in 2005. Eleanor kept the rose bush. She did not know who Carolyn Jones was, not really. She just knew that her husband had loved that plant, had talked to it, had watered it with a devotion that bordered on the religious. In 2010, Eleanor moved to an assisted living facility. She could not take the rose bush. She offered it to a neighbor, a young man who worked in television. He took it. He planted it in his own backyard. And when his daughter was born, he named her Carolyn. The rose bush still blooms. Every April around the 28th, it puts out a furious burst of red. The neighbor does not know why. He only knows that it is beautiful and that it will not die, and that every time he looks at it, he feels a strange and unexplainable sadness, as if the plant is trying to tell him something he cannot quite hear. That something's this: I was here. I suffered. I grew. I bloomed. Do not forget me. And we do not forget her. Not really. Every time a woman in a black dress looks in the mirror and decides to be unbothered, every time a girl who feels weird sits alone at lunch and imagines herself as Morticia, every time an actress past her prime refuses to apologize for her wrinkles, that is Carolyn Jones. That is the hidden collapse made visible, finally, as triumph. She showed up, she showed up, she showed up, and now at last she rests.